You finish a meal, and minutes later, you feel that familiar, burning fire creeping up your throat. You pop an antacid, assuming you have too much stomach acid. But what if you have been lied to? What if your acid reflux has nothing to do with having too much acid, but is actually a mechanical failure of a tiny valve? Today, we expose the biomechanical secret of GERD. This video is for educational purposes only. Heartburn symptoms can mimic a heart attack. If you have severe chest pain, shortness of breath, or arm, jaw pain, go to the emergency room immediately. Also, do not stop taking your prescribed PPI medications cold turkey, as this causes severe acid rebound. Work with your doctor to taper off slowly. And if you have been living in fear of food, I want to say this clearly. Your pain is real. Your symptoms are real. But the old story that reflux is simply too much acid is incomplete. In modern gastroenterology, GERD is understood as reflux of gastric contents into the esophagus. And the problem is usually the anti-reflux barrier, not an overproduction of acid. The stomach is built to handle acid, the esophagus is not. That is the shift. Not, why is my stomach attacking me? But, why is the contents of my stomach escaping upward in the first place? The stomach can be acidic for a reason: digestion, defense, and breakdown of protein. But when the barrier fails, even normal gastric contents can become a burning problem. In other words, the issue is often where the fluid goes, not simply how strong it is. Now let's talk about the gatekeeper itself. The lower esophageal sphincter, or LES. This is the muscular one-way valve at the bottom of the esophagus, working together with the diaphragm to keep stomach contents where they belong. In healthy physiology, it is supposed to stay closed most of the time, and only relax briefly when you swallow. So here is the biomechanical truth. Reflux is usually not a story of acid making too much trouble. It is a story of pressure beating the barrier. When the LES weakens or relaxes when it should not, stomach contents can move upward into the esophagus, and that is when burning begins. That is why the plastic bottle with a valve on top is such a useful metaphor. Imagine the stomach is the bottle. If the cap is sealed tightly, you can squeeze the bottle and nothing escapes. But if the valve is lazy, loose, or mechanically compromised, even a small squeeze sends fluid upward through the neck. That is what pressure does to a weak anti-reflux barrier. And that squeeze is not imaginary. After meals, the stomach distends, and that distension is a major trigger for transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxations, the brief, inappropriate valve openings that account for much of reflux. In plain English, a full, pressurized stomach can physically overwhelm the barrier, especially when the system is already vulnerable. That is why chewing matters more than people realize. When food is broken down mechanically before it reaches the stomach, the digestive workload is lower, gastric emptying can be less burdened, and the pressure profile after meals can be calmer. In studies, mastication and even chewing gum after meals have been associated with reduced post-meal acid exposure and reflux measures. So this is not about thinking positive, it is about reducing the mechanical load on a vulnerable valve. So the real question is not, how do I fight acid? The better question is, how do I lower the pressure on the valve, and help the valve stay closed when it should? That is the biomechanical mindset shift. And once you see reflux through that lens, the next layer of the problem becomes much easier to understand. Now here is the part that sounds paradoxical. People hear acid reflux and assume the solution is simply to suppress acid. But the science is more nuanced than that. In GERD, the main problem is usually failure of the anti-reflux barrier, especially transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxations, or TLESRs, and not just the amount of acid sitting in the stomach. So let me clarify the pH story carefully. The LES is designed to protect the esophagus from acidic gastric contents, and reflux symptoms happen when that protection fails. In other words, acidity matters because the esophagus is vulnerable to it. But the root problem is still the barrier, the pressure, and the timing of valve relaxation. Now for the real paradox. Acid can actually feed the reflux loop. Research has shown that acid exposure in the esophagus can increase the number of meal-induced TLESRs, which means the system can become even more prone to reflux once irritation is already happening. So the takeaway is not, weak acid keeps the valve open. The cleaner scientific version is this. When the anti-reflux barrier is unstable, reflux can trigger more reflux. Acid exposure can amplify the reflex, while gastric distension after meals can provoke those transient relaxations in the first place. That is why this is not just a chemistry problem. It is a systems problem. A pressurized stomach, a sensitive junction, and a valve that opens at the wrong time will create burning even when the story is not simply too much acid. So when people ask me, what if I have low acid? I say, that is not the first question I chase. The first question is whether the barrier is stable, whether the stomach is overdistended, and whether the valve is being asked to do too much under too much pressure. If pressure and valve instability are the real enemy, then the next question becomes, how do we lower the load on the system? Now we move from explanation to strategy. If reflux is a pressure and barrier problem, then the smartest first move is to reduce the mechanical load on the system. In practice, that means eating in a way that gives your stomach less work and your less stress. Start with chewing. Not casually. Deliberately. Break the food down until it is almost liquid before it reaches the stomach. That simple act reduces the size of the bolus, makes the stomach's job easier, and helps limit the post-meal pressure that can provoke reflux. Lifestyle reviews for GERD consistently point towards slower eating, smaller meals, and post-meal behaviors that reduce reflux burden. And the environment matters just as much as the bite size. When you eat while rushed, stressed, or scattered, digestion does not get your full physiological support. A calmer state supports the gut-brain axis and helps shift the body away from a fight or flight mode toward a more digestion-friendly state. That is why I like the phrase, digest, do not dash. Slow down the meal. Put the fork down. Breathe before the next bite. The goal is not perfection. The goal is less gastric distension, less fermentation pressure, and less upward force against a vulnerable valve. This is also why simple breath work can be useful. Diaphragmatic breathing and abdominal breathing have been studied as supportive strategies for reflux symptoms, with the idea that they may help stabilize the diaphragm-less region and reduce symptom burden in selected patients. I am not telling you this is a cure-all. I am telling you it is a mechanical support tool. So the first lifestyle strategy is mechanical precision. Chew thoroughly, eat more slowly, and enter meals from a calmer nervous system. These are not glamorous interventions, but they directly reduce the pressure that tries to pry open the valve. Now we close the loop. When reflux keeps showing up, I want you to think beyond the esophagus and look lower down the system. GERD commonly overlaps with bloating and constipation, and pressure from gastric or intestinal distension can promote transient less relaxations, the very valve events that allow reflux to happen. So the lower gut matters because pressure upstream matters. That is why the mechanical strategy is not complicated, but it is disciplined. Support regular transit, reduce abdominal distension, And avoid giving the valve extra pressure to fight all day long. The more calm, spacious, and efficient the system is, the less likely it is to force contents back upward. That is also where a premium digestive support protocol may fit. Sinogut's official site describes it as a natural supplement formulated to support gut balance, regularity, and digestive wellness with fibers, probiotics, and herbal extracts. So in the context of this blueprint, think of it as support, not as a replacement for real medical care. And I need to say this clearly. Do not stop prescribed PPIs on your own and do not quit them cold turkey. Rebound acid hypersecretion can occur after PPI withdrawal, and some people experience a flare of heartburn or regurgitation when they stop suddenly. Any taper should be discussed with your clinician. So here is the protocol in one sentence. Chew thoroughly, eat calmly, support regular transit, lower pressure, and build a digestive environment that does not keep assaulting a vulnerable valve. If this gave you a new framework, use it as a blueprint, and work with your physician on anything involving prescription medication or persistent symptoms. And remember, chest pain, shortness of breath, or pain spreading to the arm or jaw is not something to watch at home. Get emergency help right away, and make any medication changes with your doctor's guidance.